Hey mushroom nerds, Anna McHugh here. I want to introduce this video which is primarily about Magnolia, Xylaria mushrooms and my favorite mushroom books. But I want to make a couple of corrections because I made a couple of misstatements throughout the course of the video. And so I want to make sure that, we're all on the same page and that I have covered my bases, etc. and so on. But before I do that, or to, pay you or make restitution for these errors, I want to share with you a couple of kind of dilapidated but still rather pretty specimens of the shaggy-stalked bolete. Areoboletus betula is the common name for this, and if you are new to mushroom hunting, get to know this mushroom. It is very tart and lovely, and the stem is kind of yum. Anyway, I have a couple of videos about it, but I did want to, highlight it because it is up and about, and also I wanted to, show you something before I dive into my notebook with my corrections. Okay, so let's get into the corrections. So, first of all, the video is primarily about Xylaria magnoliae, which is this little fingery mushroom. It kind of looks antlery that grows on Xylaria cones. And I talked about some of the research that's been done by Danny Newman and Roo Vandergrift, who are two mycological researchers who did a lot of work in the Los Cedros protected forest in the Andes. And so it is a cloud forest, a very unique ecosystem, and some really beautiful research in a film that they participated in called Marrow of the Mountain, and also some research that I'll add to the description if you want to check it out. However, so they did some research around Xylaria, and Danny talked about it at a conference I went to recently, so I got super excited and got out over my skis, and then I talked to y'all about it in a video, and I don't want to get rid of the video. So here we go. I'm going to correct a couple of things I said about Danny and Roo and his work. So first of all, the location, I accidentally slipped of the tongue, called the area, the area they were working in the Amazon at one point. It is not the Amazon, it is the Andes, so mountains. Additionally, I want to clarify that the area that they're talking about, the Los Cedros forest, is a protected forest, but not a national park. And I kind of hemmed and hawed of national park, national forest, I don't know, but it is a protected forest is its designation. A couple of other things on Xylaria. Probably my most significant error is I talked about Xylaria hypoxylon. So it's this little antler-looking mushroom, and I made a mistake. So I thought Danny was saying that genetically turned out to be very different from its other sort of branchy relatives in the Xylaria genus and needed to move. Turns out he was talking about a different group of mushrooms called it's a genus called the Xylobutrium. And so that genus has been sort of lumped in with all the different Xylarias and needs to be moved into its own genetic class. So it is moving out of a big fungal group and a pretty substantial migration to a different part of the tree of life. Nonetheless, it would be I think it would be a bigger deal, and certainly a bigger deal on the street for mushroom hunters, if Xylaria hypoxylon had to move, because it is a mushroom that we are often very familiar with, and it's kind of a great image to, imagine what the Xylaria little fingery genus looks like. Okay, let's see. Other things. Index fungorum, I make a reference to that, and I say it's a genetic database. Not a genetic database, it is an index. It is a list of names, a list of deprecated names and current names and scientific names and synonyms and all of that stuff. So no genetic stuff, it is just the listing service for the different species. And then I think finally I made a mistake in calling the ringless honey mushroom Desarmillaria tabescens, and the scientific name is Desarmillaria cespitosa. Armillaria tabescens used to be the scientific name for it, and so what I did is I took Desarmillaria and tabescens and mashed them together, and that is incorrect. It's just it's a portmanteau of two scientific names for the ringless honey mushroom. So again, Desarmillaria cespitosa, Xylaria hypoxylon, as far as we know, is staying where it is. Thank you for your time. I hope you do spend some time, looking around for these little mushrooms. Again, these are kind of beat up because I neglected them for, a day or two, but they really are lovely, tart little mushrooms. And as with all of the things that we find, I just get such delight out of the the event that mushrooms represent. You know, they're not a thing, they're not a tree that's there all the time. They're a moment, they're a happening. Like I sound very much like I'm trying to plan some sort of, you know, something that is a little fancier than mushroom hunting in my backyard. But for the time being, I hope you enjoyed the video about, again, primarily about books, but hopefully I also haven't made any errors in my error correction video. We'll talk soon, and I hope you enjoy it. Hey, mushroom nerds, it's Anna McHugh. I'm spending a little bit of time in my front yard after work with my magnificent magnolia tree you can see the trunk of behind me, and also a fungus that specializes on discarded magnolia cones. So this is a mushroom that is called the magnolia cone flickering. The scientific name for this is Xylaria magnolia. So it's Xylaria in case you're interested. So it's one of those X's that's a Z phonetically. But this is a bizarre little mushroom in a bizarre genus of many hundreds of species. So I'll talk to you about, you know, how to identify this little inedible but super cool looking mushroom. And then I'm also going to talk about some of my favorite books and materials. So I've been doing this channel for a couple of years now, 3 years, I think. And I occasionally mention the books and materials that I really like, but I wanted to go through them because I'm like right next to my library as opposed to out in the woods or at my favorite mushroom hunting office park. All right, so before we do that, I do want to talk about Xylaria magnoliae. So, you know, again, if you have a magnolia tree, and I believe that this one is probably a Sweet Bay magnolia. So in North Carolina, my understanding is we have Sweet Bay and also Southern magnolia. And I can't tell the difference between the two of them, but suffice it to say, magnolia trees are very, very long-lived, and they're also a very ancient organism. So in terms of this little collection of trees that I have, you know, I've got pine, a couple of tulip, poplar, of course, sweet gumball trees, which are marvelous feature of the South if you're not lucky enough to have them. I kid, they're really obnoxious. Anyway, magnolia trees are very long-lived, and they also don't grow as, you know, kind of tall and spiky as a lot of our other broadleaf trees. It's evergreen as well, and then additionally, you know, this tree I think is in the neighborhood of 200 odd years old, and it was brought here when this house was built. And so it's, you can't see, but it's not a very tall tree, but it has this very, you know, thick and robust kind of wood. And the real dead giveaway for magnolias, besides these like huge cones that turn into huge flowers, you also have these big sort of leathery leaves, and I just let them pile up in front of my house. It's not the smartest thing in the world. They're very slippery at times, but the reason for that is that when the cones accumulate and then they get covered up by these giant leaves, oftentimes you get an accumulation of moisture that will make these little you know, flickerings come out. And I love the common name flickering because really the flame-like appearance of this sort of carbony mushroom is very evident when you look at it closely. So you know, Xylaria magnoliae fruits throughout the spring and summer. It's one of those like mushrooms that I come out into my yard to look at when I'm feeling grim about the mushroom season often. So as far as its distinguishing features, I'm gonna try and see if we can get a little bit better view of the surfaces using my headlamp. Okay, a little bit. So what you can see is kind of a black fruiting body initially, and you know, again, it just sprouts out in these amazing little fingers off of the fruiting body, and you can see that the surface is a little bit sort of roughened and almost like very fine sandpaper. And then as the mushroom starts to mature and develop spores, the tips of the mushroom start to get sort of a grayish white color. And so this is one that's starting to sporulate. Actually, let's bring back the headlamp because I think we could do a spore poof for you. Let's see here. Okay, so we're gonna give him a little light. Oh, there we go. Okay, So, oh yeah, we got a little spore stream going on. Okay. I often strike out with this because I'm really enthusiastic with handling mushrooms when I make videos, and sometimes the spores are like, you already knocked us off, and so I'm glad you could see the little spore poof. But anyway, this is an easy mushroom to identify, again, because it's so specific to magnolia cones. I also find it fascinating. This is a decomposer, so it's, you know, specifically decomposing this thing, which means that it has, you know, specialized evolutionarily over the course of time. It's also fascinating to me that not only are magnolia trees very long-lived, they are also one of the oldest terrestrial organisms and plants on the planet. And so they are estimated to be, I think it's 100 million years old. So they're really, really ancient species. And so the relationship between this very specific decomposer and the cones is probably, you know, not equally ancient, but probably really, really old. And I mention that because there are a lot of mushrooms, like, God, on the other end of the spectrum, you have the oyster mushroom, which is also a decomposer, but it will decompose like almost anything. You can feed it newspaper, you can feed it straw, you can feed it wood. It will just like gorge itself on organic material and dissolve it and turn it into food. But Xylaria magnoliae is a little more picky, and nonetheless, it's a very, you know, numerous species when it's around. So I want to talk about my books, and then I'm going to return to Xylaria and talk about some of the trivia around that particular genus. So I did just return from the North American Mycological Association Appalachia foray, so I'm still like riding high on my interest in mushrooms that I cannot eat, and that's great. But I also learned some really interesting things about Xylaria in the cloud forests of the Amazon, so stay tuned if you're into that kind of thing. All right, so books-wise, this is the field guide that I highly recommend, not just necessarily for people who live in North and South Carolina. This is just a great book by Alan and Arlene Bissett and also Michael Hopping. So they are prolific authors in the mushroom space, and you'll see their names on a lot of guidebooks. But Mushrooms of the Carolinas is an exceptionally good book. As you can see, I've got all kinds of like little notes and things. But it is a really good sort of overview and primer of this region. And that's very, very helpful. Like when you're just getting started with mushroom hunting, and I made this mistake, you may be tempted to buy a comprehensive book that covers, you know, all of North America, or even a massive region like the eastern United States or west of the Rocky Mountains. And the reality is that can be very daunting. So at NAMA, at the foray I went to this last weekend, we totaled 535 species collected over the course of 2.5 days. And so the vast diversity of mushrooms, even within our region of the southeastern US, is more than enough for me to bite off. And it's also, you know, when you're talking about mushrooms, is really helpful when you're learning them to be able to not see them every day, but at least have a chance of seeing them. So, you know, I love to look at mushrooms from all around the world. To my point, I'll talk about Ecuador, Xylarias, and other things. But when it comes to learning, especially if you are just getting started, but also me, like this is the book that I use first and foremost to get started. And so again, Alan and Arlene Bissett and Michael Hopping. I also got to spend some time with them at that foray. That was great. Arlene was the hosting mycologist. And so there are all kinds of, you know, really remarkable people at that event. So that's a quick plug for NAMA. It was really great to collect 535 species and see them all within a gym and people labeling everything and recording everything. It was really fantastic, even though the gymnasium we had that collection in did not smell very fantastic by the end of it. Okay, so yes, Mushrooms of the Carolinas. And I mentioned this is good for a lot of other sort of parts of the Southeast as well, because it has a lot of focus on our, like, North Carolina has a lot of cool ecological zones. So we have the mountains, we have, you know, the coastal plain, we have the Piedmont where I live. There's a couple of different sort of areas within the mountains that are very distinct and different. And so this is great for like a sampling of some of the things you'll see in the Southeast. So, you know, if you're north of the Carolinas or south of the Carolinas, I still think I still think this is worth the price of admission. Okay, mushrooms of the Carolinas, that is the first stop. I also like, well, gosh, this is another one that I just picked up by the Bassett's. This is a brand spanking new book called Mushrooms, well, it's a field guide for mushrooms of Georgia. As you can see, it's brand spanking new, so I haven't spent much time with it, but it's always nice to get a new mushroom book. And another thing I've noticed, I've been doing mushroom hunting for a long time, and, you know, the books have gotten a lot less expensive in the last few years, is my observation. And so even though this is a big, you know, massive tome, it is really nice also to just have these resources. And so you have photographs, you have really good sort of structured information about different species. If you're not familiar with field guides, that is just a great way to familiarize yourself with not just the mushrooms you're looking at, but also the different traits and features that are important in identifying them. So let's take a look at a species description right here. So we have Areo, oh, we opened to one of my favorite genera, look at that, Areoboletus russellii, and you can kind of see the photos anyway. I'm not going to dwell on this, but what we have is the name of the folks who published that species, which is helpful if you want to read their papers. You have a common name, macroscopic features, so like what you would observe in the field, which includes cap, pore surface or gill surface, tubes, so in the case of this mushroom, it doesn't have gills or whatever, it has little tubes on the bottom, the stalk, and then the flesh itself. So it's really important to cut mushrooms open when you collect them for identification. I am egregious about this. Like, I have collected mushrooms and not cut them open, and then we can't really positively identify them because mushrooms can do all kinds of interesting staining and bruising reactions when you slice them open. So flesh is the last of those like basic items that you look at. Then there are microscopic features. The spore print is sort of a distinct section. I usually skip that, honestly, because typically I can observe some of the spores when I collect the mushroom. You have the habitat and season, and also the habit, meaning how many you will see at once. And so, you know, if it's a mushroom that's solitary and likes to hang out by itself, that's where that would be noted. You have edibility, and then comments. That's just a really short description of the mushroom, but also sometimes, you know, synonyms and other information. That is not like used across all field guides, but that's a really good standard. And again, just getting familiar with those entries gives you a lot of ideas about how to proceed when you see something marvelous but weird like this. So you can kind of pick it apart and see like what different components it has. Okay, so regional field guides, that's top of the line because that helps me sort of understand the environment around me, and there's so many mushrooms that is not where my ambitions stop, but outside of that is extra credit. Okay, so next up, I really fancy books that are specific to a particular type of mushroom. So oftentimes this is an order or a genus. This is a book I've talked about a good bit, Amanitas of North America by J. Justice and Britt Bunyard. This is a really nice book also. It's like when I am flipping through a book in the evening and I just want to feast my eyes on some gorgeous photos, it's a great book for that. But it also has a really good treatment of the Amanita genus by species section. And Amanita as a genus, like, it's divided into sections. There are a lot of different species. They're very numerous and very vibrant. Like, some of them are really brightly colored, some of them are deadly poisonous. So that split into different sections makes this a really good resource for the Amanita genus. You probably wouldn't get the same utility if you had split, you know, other, oh, for instance, I didn't bring it out with me, but I have another Bassett book, if you can sense a theme here, which is a bolete book. And so the Boletaceae are those spongy, sort of porous undersurface mushrooms. And that book is, for the most part, split up by different genera. So, you know, different bolete type genus sections. Whereas Amanita, we're splitting it into sections within the genus itself for some reason. So, you know, tailoring your needs to the kind of mushrooms you're interested in is fun. That also gives you a chance to be like, okay, you know, this will happen all the time. You start with a field guide, you get to where you're kind of, you know, not necessarily confident, but you're making progress, but it's not in there. And then you're like, okay, where do I go next? Do I go to the internet? And that can be a huge rabbit hole, and I'm not going to talk about it today. Do I go to, you know, a really big, more comprehensive guide, like the new Audubon guide for mushrooms? Or do I just give up? And so it's really helpful to have these, you know, area-specific guides as an intermediary step, because it's like well-vetted and edited information that you can sort of get further without being like, it's not my field guide, but I have a couple of ideas to Google. Like, that can just be really hard and tedious, time-consuming, and all the other things. Okay, so if you are looking for a book that is just for beginners as far as foraging, but also just a basic introduction to mushroom hunting, the things you want to do, see, and experience with it, I have to recommend The Complete Mushroom Hunter by Gary Linkoff. This book was published in 2010, so there are a couple of scientific names that are out of date, but those things are trivial because this book covers essentially a very good collection of the poisonous mushrooms to look out for and the best edible mushrooms that people have been eating for generations and have a really good understanding of. So if you are just getting started at, you know, mushroom hunting, this is a great book, as with that Amanita book I was showing you. It also has ginormous photos. So here's a photograph of Grifola frondosa, hen of the woods, which is a gorgeous, wonderful edible mushroom we'll see in the fall. So one of the other things I do want to mention about this is it is a slender book, but it also has really great information in it about citizen science and how to sort of like dive into the non-foraging component. So like if you just want to find some edible mushrooms, and that's great, like that's a fucking fantastic hobby, this is the book for you. If you want to be like, I'm interested in wild edibles, but I'm also kind of interested about all this like sciencey taxonomy stuff, this is a really good book to start with. And the reason I say that is not because it has some complex treatments of how the taxonomy stuff happens. It instead gives a really good introduction, again, to those key points of like where to find them. And let's see, immigrant communities that eat mushrooms and the variety of sort of cultural issues in America that influence how we think about them. Another thing that I really love about it, I'm trying to find it. It's really handy. Oh yeah, okay, here we go. So just like where to find mushrooms and when. So it's like, I'm in my lawn. What can I find in the early spring? What can I find in the summertime? So it is a really approachable way to get into the hobby, and it gives you that sort of overview of the areas you can take it if you want to get into the, you know, get to the place where you're going to mushroom forays and collecting 535 species and then having like a, you know, mushroom related euphoria for several days, as I have. Okay, so I've gone on at some length about all of that. The one other thing I want to note, like these are all books that I literally keep within arm's reach of me, just in case I want something to like look at and flip through. Sometimes I'm like, I'm going to put my phone physically away from me, and I'm going to put these books close to me so that I look at them. Another fun little thing, and I am not disciplined about trees, like I was just talking about. I don't know what magnolia that is. I should figure it out, and I'm sure I will, but I haven't gotten there yet. So I picked up this little tree finder book for myself. And, you know, I'm not specifically recommending it, although I've gotten a lot of use out of it, and it was super cheap. But it is a very fast, like, overview of a lot of the different tree leaves and brief descriptions of things. And that has been really useful to me, again, as just sort of a like thing that I can flip through, because learning trees is instrumental to learning mushrooms. Not only the mushrooms that are symbiotic, but also mushrooms like this decomposer, Xylaria magnoliae. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Xylaria trivia, because I can't help myself. So in Index Fungorum, and that is the genetic database of different, well, it's not just genetics, but it's like all of the information about the different mushroom species that we have. The Xylaria genus, which is primarily decomposers, but we have other sort of lifestyles and ways that they, support themselves and source nutrition. But many of them are decomposers, so you'll find them typically growing on wood or downed organic material. Additionally, in Index Fungorum, I think there is in the neighborhood of 560 species listed. Those entries include synonyms, and so that count is not like a firm count. And to that point, even though we have an understanding of this genus, and we have sort of different species that sort of represent it really well, like this sort of flamey or clubby and carbonous and a little bit sort of warty, roughened on the surface, are very common features. But we certainly haven't explored the depths or gotten our heads around Xylaria. So when I was at NAMA this past weekend, I had the great good fortune of seeing a presentation by a mycologist named Danny Newman, and he did a project with another mycologist named Roo Vandergrift. And what they did is they went down and did a lot of fungal diversity surveying in Los Cedros, I believe is how you pronounce it. It is a massive natural, I guess it's a national park, I believe, in Ecuador. And so this is a cloud forest. It is really underexplored. And they spent a lot of time there documenting, rare and unknown fungi. And one of the things that Danny focused on in his presentation was the Xylaria genus. And he showed some photographs of Xylarias that are have some of these features, but are also really weird and unusual. And so, you could just see the emergence of a lot of new scientific research and understanding from these mushrooms and exploring them. And one of the things that he shared, and I'm not going to get into too much of the detail, but I was talking about how the genus Xylaria has a type species. And so each genus has sort of a species that's not a perfect, but a decent representation of that genus. And in the case of Xylaria, we have a thing, and this is another book. This is a new one, the updated Mushrooms of North America Audubon Guide. I've been getting a kick out of this book. I would say that if you're a beginner, I think you should get it, but you may find that it is not a starting place for your research and learning necessarily. First of all, because it is massive, but also it has a different organizational system that's based on some of the genetics, and it doesn't list edibility information. Now, for me, I freaking love this book. It has so much great information, and it has marvelous species descriptions that are written in plain English. And so this is a great book. I don't want to, at all say that it isn't. But I think that if I had picked this up as a beginner, I would have been what's going on here? Why is it organized this way? There's a lot of stuff that doesn't look similar to other stuff next to each other. But anyway, I encourage you to check it out. Jacob Polk is the individual who wrote species descriptions. Actually, I think Roo Vandergrift, who I was just talking about, did a foreword here, if I'm not mistaken. So, and the photographs were sourced from iNaturalist. So, it is different in a lot of respects from every book that we have, because most of the books are, curated photographs and written by the same individuals. And so this is different. It presents a different format. The species descriptions are a little bit different, but also the species descriptions are phenomenal. I am a big fan both of language and specific words, but I'm also a fan of clarity and plain language for communicating about anything, but certainly mushrooms. It's just awfully hard. So anyway, I'm holding up the page that shows the type species. Here, let's see if I can do a little better here. The type species for the Xylaria genus. Oh, there we go. Carbon antlers, as you can see. So this is identified as Xylaria hypoxylon species group. Did I lose the place? I think I did. Oh, nuts. On the opposing page, I wanted to show you, is another Xylaria you should look out for if you're not aware of it already. It is Xylaria polymorpha, also known as dead man's fingers. So it's a very sort of like gothy little carbony hard fruiting body that can come out of, you know, the ground or pieces of wood, and as it sporulates it forms these little sort of pale tips, the same way that our Xylarias do, but they look more like fingers because they're very clubby and they can cluster. It's marvelous and very weird. So anyway, back to Xylaria hypoxylon species group, these antler shaped Xylaria mushrooms. Danny was talking about how he had been exploring them and looking at, you know, a variety of different specimens in the cloud forest, and he actually suspects that that specific species group, hypoxylon, actually doesn't belong in Xylaria at all. It doesn't belong in the order, like above it taxonomically, the Xylariaceae, I think it is. He was like, it needs to be in its own class entirely. So like we're taking the species by which we understand a whole genus and saying, actually, we're gonna like move it not just a little to the left or a little to the right or split a genus in half or whatever. We're moving it up and over to the left a whole bunch. And so like these sort of genetic analyses and looking at these rare or underdocumented mushrooms is really critical to understanding them and their life cycles and all that fun stuff. So before I talk about one final interesting thing that Xylarias do, I want to mention how you can learn more about Roo and Danny's work. So there's a documentary film called Marrow of the Mountain that features a lot of their photography and the documentation of the vast and undocumented diversity in that area. It also features the voices of a lot of folks who live in that area, because there's a tremendous amount of land that has been opened up to mining, and so a lot of these habitats are very much under threat. And you know, as you can imagine, these habitats are unique in ways that we're only just now starting to understand. You know, going out in my backyard, the Appalachian Mountains that are well populated and have been for a very, very long time, we're finding new stuff that we haven't seen all the time. Can you imagine, you know, you have a small crew of mycologists who go down, and one guy who's really willing to stay up all night and look at these under the microscope and dry them out and send them to somebody for DNA analysis. Like we just don't know what we are at risk of losing. So I do encourage you to check out Marrow of the Mountain. It can really bring into focus some of those issues and some of the just stupendous beauty and diversity and weirdness of those habitats. And when I say weirdness, I mean like nature to me is just weird. So I'm not talking about Ecuador's ecosystems being weird. Like I find my own front yard with my 100-million-year-old tree and its highly specialized decomposer to be adequately weird for any day of the week. All right, so the last thing I'm gonna say about Xylaria that I really want to observe is, and it doesn't happen with this species, unfortunately, so, and I don't remember which one, but some of the ones that Danny showed also had this feature. So they form different fruiting body types during their life cycle, which is profoundly confusing to mycologists. So some of the time you would see a Xylaria and it looks a good bit like this. And then there is an asexual version of the mushroom that sprouts, and they tend to look way more like little jelly fungi, like clubby and a little bit warped. They're just like bizarre looking, and they look like something entirely different. They don't look like mushrooms. And so these two categories of sexual and asexual fruiting body forms, the sexual version is a teleomorph. So this is a hot teleomorph that will produce spores for us. One more. No. Okay. But, you know, one sporulates and spreads its genetic material, and the other category is called animorphs, and they're not a children's book series, but instead these very strange asexual fruiting bodies. And I don't know much about it, but I encourage you to learn about it because it's really interesting, and I also suspect that some of these anamorphic things are going to, we're going to find more of them and realize, well, I think we've already found a whole lot of them, but we haven't understood that they are anamorphs of this teleomorphic, you know, it's the same fungus, but it produces two different things outside of its mycelial network for one reason or another. So that is all I have for you today. I've had a lot of bug bites, but I think, actually, I was going to talk very, very briefly about AI. And just the provenance of your educational materials. I don't know much about this either because it's, of course, emerging, but I saw some articles today that Amazon has a field guide, like AI written field guides are popping up on Amazon for sale. And in looking at them, a lot of them are full of bogus information, you know, photographs that are manufactured. And a lot of, because these large language models are also consuming information, but like in the mushroom space, there's not nearly as much information. There's a lot of stuff that's like, gosh, that's downright plagiarism as far as how closely it resembles source material. My own experiments with using large language models to, you know, learn about mushrooms have been very fruitless, pun intended, so far. So, you know, I've asked it questions of all kinds. So, like, really basic stuff, like, how do you tell if a mushroom is edible? And it spouted back to me that you should, as a forager, avoid red mushrooms, which is ridiculous and makes no sense at all. That brown-gilled mushrooms are a really good place to start as a forager. Also really bad advice because there are some very toxic mushrooms with brown gills. And it said a couple of other ridiculous things, and I was just like, okay, it doesn't know what it's talking about. I've asked it about Gomphus floccosus, the scaly chanterelle, which is a beautiful species, and some people enjoy eating it, and some people, it doesn't agree with them. However, ChatGPT-3 is convinced that it is a prized edible, and that's just simply not the case, at least not here. And I don't know of anywhere in the world where Turbinellus, it used to be Gomphus, Turbinellus floccosus, the scaly chanterelle, or I guess we're trying to change the common name away from chanterelle because it's not a chanterelle at all, it's a Turbinellus. But anyway, the Turbinellus floccosus isn't anything on the top of any of my friends' basket lists. So, you know, it's given me really bad information. I also asked it to write a brief article in my voice about honey mushrooms. And as best as I can tell, it went and ate some very old blog posts of mine and spat out basically a bunch of garbage. And so, you know, it said that honey mushrooms are great and wonderful, and they can be parasitic, but they can also be symbiotic and useful, which is, I mean, ringless honey mushrooms, Desarmellaria tibescens, has like wiped out a massive number of the trees that I do have here. And so my feelings about them as parasites that are really a problem is very clearly defined, but one way or the other, ChatGPT determined that I love all mushrooms, and all mushrooms are great, even the ones that kill the trees that I live with. So all of that to say, you know, if you're on Amazon and you're looking for a field guide, I would stick with well-known authors. So, you know, Gary Linkoff, this book, it's a great example. He wrote the first, like the 1981 edition of the Audubon Field Guide. He was, and he passed, I believe, in 2015. He was one of the most beloved people in the community. He was based out of New York and the botanical gardens there. And so he had an eye for how to find mushrooms in human landscapes, which always opens the hobby up so much. And he was so open and warm and friendly and so knowledgeable. And so, you know, if you're looking for books, like, look out for names that have that track record. So, you know, Gary Linkoff. The Bassett's, if you're interested in North American mushrooms, you're going to see a lot of titles, like 20-some titles by them. And, you know, on the West Coast, you have authors like Noah Siegel and David Aurora. And also just like, if you're looking at a mushroom book, and there are good new mushroom books that come out all the time. So I'm not saying avoid new mushroom books or avoid new authors. Definitely don't do that. Just before you buy a field guide, not just mushrooms apparently, but also plants. And plants can be way more dangerous than mushrooms, but we won't go there today. But, you know, if you're buying a field guide, make sure that you look up the author, look up other things that they've written or who they are. Like, luckily the, you know, generative AI thing is so early that oftentimes you can spot the things that are bad, or you can just scratch the surface and be like, this is a content farm. But nonetheless, like, it's out there. These things are purchasable. Please be careful, because again, my experience with these large language models so far is they've given me potentially deadly advice a couple of times, and that is enough for me to say, you know what, I want to use you know, books. I want to communicate with people who are collecting and participate in forums. I want to use the internet, but I want to use authoritative websites. So amanitaceae.org, mushroomexpert.com are the two top ones that I visit. And then I want to use technology to bring together and aggregate observations and data that are meaningful to me. So iNaturalist is where I do that. And that is human beings, citizen scientists, people at mushroom forays, professional, you know, academics, getting together and pooling their data. And that is how I extend the knowledge I can get out of my own observations and my books and the different methods for identifying a mushroom. At the point at which I have a hypothesis of what it is, I go into iNaturalist and I filter by research grade observations, and I oftentimes can find a tremendous number of photos that give me a sense of the variability of those fruiting bodies. And because mushrooms can really vary in their life cycle and due to all kinds of different factors, being able to say, okay, I have an idea or even a genus that I want to research, and that's usually where I get to. I'm like, okay, unless it's something I know very well, I get to a genus if I can, and then I go over to the internet and I learn about the genus a little bit more. And you know, I go to iNaturalist and I look at different species collections, and that is an invaluable way to build that information up. But also, you know, that is fantastic, and I think that's really where we're set to make a lot of progress as far as technology assisting with this work. But I cannot understate, and this is, you know, it's kind of sentimental, but meeting with mushroom people, or even just communicating with them and engaging with them, is really wonderful. You have this exchange of information, and it's not data, it's information, it's stories, it's, you know, I went and, for instance, like, I don't know very much, but I plan to get myself a UV light to look at bioluminescent fungi, and there are a lot of them, or UV sensitive fungi, and there are a lot of them. So I'm going to get into that. I will also share a video of that. And, you know, some of these Xylarias glow in the dark, and being able to exchange information with people about that, or see a presentation by a Danny Newman and follow up on, you know, his and Roo's work, is really rewarding, because you're a part of this emerging science. And also, there's something really special about the observational nature of mushroom hunting. And so, like, I went to the foray and I loved every bit of it, but I'm also a little bit reclusive. It's one of the reasons I like mushroom hunting, and I love going into the forest and listening to my nerdy tech podcasts and collecting things that I don't know much about. But, you know, even so I'm not like out with my friends mushroom hunting every weekend. That's preposterous. That would stress me out a lot. But, you know, engaging with that community online and in forums for identification and all kinds of different stuff has built up a rich community of people that I can talk with. And when it comes to these sort of conversations about regional stuff, or these things that we don't know very much about, that is really, really interesting and well worth the time. Anyway, I have taken a lot of your time if you're still here. If you're not, hopefully you have more insight about Xylaria, but even if you're not here, I don't know why wishing you great success with the Xylaria genus is much use. Anyway, I've said enough. Find a billion mushrooms. I hope you're doing well, and we'll talk again soon.